Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this talk, Podcast Deal or No Deal, the knowledge you need to navigate the podcast landscape. My name is Charlotte Ewing, and I am the Brand and Partnerships Lead at Mags Creative. So why do you need knowledge to navigate the landscape? Well, the podcast landscape can be complicated and messy. Independent creators can still rise to the top, but equally there are huge companies committing multi-million-dollar deals to the space. Some creators do weekly podcasts, some do seasonal podcasts, some with videos, some without. There's multiple distribution platforms, which mean we don't even have a central hub to all work from. But I'm here today to hopefully tell you that just because it's complicated and perhaps a little bit chaotic, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. And that actually, this bittiness means that you can be creative in the way you move around the industry, and that there's no status quo for you to follow. No one can say, this is how it's done, because we're all figuring it out together. So over the next 30 minutes, I hope to give you a bit of knowledge, a lot of stats, for you to be able to go and navigate this space with confidence and make deals for yourself. But first of all, why are you listening to me? I'm sure you've been to a lot of talks today. Well, I first started working in podcasting about 4 years ago now. At that time, I literally thought the only thing there was to do in podcasting was interview format podcasts and sponsorship ads. At the time, I was a huge fan of the high-low. I'm sure we all were, and I still remember their NARS and Sainsbury's ads to this day. But now, after being in the industry for a bit longer, I know there is so much more to it. And as I said, I am the Brand and Partnerships Lead at Mags. And we work across 3 different verticals. So we create exclusive content for the distribution platforms, for commissioning bodies, so for Spotify and for Amazon. We create branded content that people actually want to listen to. And we also create our own originals. So if you've heard of Life Sentence, I think our wonderful Kelsey is talking another panel at 3, who's a producer of Life Sentence, and we won an ARIAs for that a couple of months ago. So that's a bit of a plug for us. But hopefully, because I work across all these 3 different verticals and I've made a deal in all of them, I have the knowledge to pass on to you today. Right, let's get into it. This is what we're going to cover today. We're going to start by doing an overview of the industry in stats, and then we're going to talk about the key players operating in it, and then we're going to talk about the different deals you can make, and then we're going to have a little look at the future trends that might be worth having an eye on coming up, and then we will have a bit of time for Q&A. But before I start, I wanted to just say that I'm going to be throwing a lot of stats at you, and I haven't got all the sources directly in the PowerPoint because it was going to make it a bit ugly. But if there's any stat that you heard, just come to me afterwards and I can tell you where I got it from, or you can email me. I also just wanted to say that this landscape session definitely isn't exhaustive. There is so much more to it, but hopefully it's a really good overview and a great place to start. I also wanted to start by debunking some podcast myths. So this is my myth slide. I'm sure you all hear this a lot. I'm sure we all do, that podcasting is an oversaturated market, that there are loads of podcasts out there right now. Well, yes, there are 2.2 million podcasts out there, but there are also 2.2 million books published in just 1 year in the US, and there are 27 million YouTube channels. And of those 2.2 million podcasts, only 18% are actually active podcasts. So we still have quite a way to go before there are too many podcasts. Another myth I hear a lot is that podcasts are just the newest thing. It's a hype that will blow over. And again, the data just doesn't back that up. Podcasting isn't going anywhere because the advertising is just so effective. So 65% of listeners say they actually pay attention to the adverts they hear in a podcast. That's compared to 39% of TV viewers who say they pay attention to TV ads, and only 38% of listeners who listen to the radio. Right, we've got those myths out the way. Let's get into it. So I wanted to begin by clarifying the size of the industry we're talking about. So how big really is the podcast industry? So we know, It can make you feel a little bit like this when you try to do it. Have a look at it. So we know that 25% of the UK population are listening to podcasts every month. That is over 20 million people. And it's no small business when it comes to advertising either. In Q1 of this year, iHeartMedia, which is an American podcast platform, reported revenue of $69 million in their podcast business. That means that their podcast business now makes up 8% of their total income, and it was only 2% in 2020. A report from Insider Intelligence forecasts that podcasting ad revenue will exceed $2 billion in the next year. But you're probably thinking, well, that's the US, they're years ahead of us, right? Well, it's no small business in the UK either. BetterHelp, the online counselling service, spent almost $27.5 million in podcast sponsorship in 2021. HelloFresh, who I'm sure we all know and perhaps use, spent almost $10.5 million in 2021. And the total podcast spend last year was $46 million. So what does this mean to you as a creator? Well, it means the landscape is sophisticating. It means that brands see podcasting as a really serious advertising channel and that money is being invested into the industry. And we really believe that a rising tide lifts all ships. Okay, so we've looked at the size of the industry. Now to look at the players that are operating in it. So what do I mean when I say a key player? So I do not mean the key players of our generation, the WAGs at the 2005 World Cup. What do I mean? So I'm talking about a platform or a company whose actions will have a knock-on effect to you guys as independent creators. So before I go into my key players, I just want to do a quick caveat that I have no insight into these companies beyond what's already public, but I hope that by collating all the information for you guys here today, it's really useful. So let's start with good old BBC. So in Q4 of 2021, the BBC reported 257 million podcast downloads. That makes them the third biggest podcast publisher in the world. Just last month, they announced cuts and said that Radio 4 Extra was being moved online. This saves them £500 million. So if we think about that huge listenership married to the relative inexpense of online content, we can say pretty safely that podcasts will continue to be a priority for the platform. So they might not be the newest or most sexy platform, but they have a huge amount of public service money to invest into podcasting. Next up, Spotify. So these guys were the home of the landmark deals in 2019 and 2020, which I'm sure we all heard about. They reportedly spent $25 million getting Harry and Meghan on board, reportedly spent $200 million getting Joe Rogan on board, and this all brought a lot of external interest into the podcast space. They're going to continue to lose money from all these acquisitions until 2022, apparently, in the next 1 or 2 years, they're going to start making profit from all of this. They're trying to be the kind of go-to place for everything podcast or everything audio. So they've recently launched CTA cards. I don't know if you guys have seen them yet, but it basically means that when you listen to a podcast on Spotify and there's an ad, you'll be able to look down at your phone and click through to the product the ad is talking about, making it a really kind of seamless process, which of course brands love. They also are the kind of trailblazers when it comes to integrating video and audio. So they've now, as a creator, you can upload a video version of your podcast onto the platform. And that basically means that as a listener, you'll be able to be on the tube, go downstairs on the tube, listening to your podcast, sit down on the tube, get your phone out, watch a video of that podcast, and then so you get to your stop, put your phone in your pocket, and carry on your way. And there is no disruption to the audio quality in that whole process, which is obviously really interesting. They've also opened Spotify subscriptions, so as a creator, you can monetize your show with them. And just this week, actually, they've also announced that they are looking into audiobooks. So really trying to kind of get a monopoly of the audio space. Amazon Music. So these guys are another distribution platform. They also create their own original content and have 200,000 podcasts on their platform and over 55 million users. So I don't know if any of you guys have your podcasts on there, but it's really a good one to think about, especially if we think about the fact that Amazon Music is pre-downloaded onto all Alexas. In the US, there is over 40 million households that have an Alexa. So if we think about the fact that a quarter of all time smart speaker listening is podcasts, that's 10 million people who could be listening to your podcast. So it's a really good one to think about. Apple Podcasts, I'm sure you guys know about this one, but they are the most popular amongst long-time listeners. They offer subscriptions, and they don't make their own original content in the same way that Amazon and Spotify does. Apple TV does make their own stuff, so that's a kind of bit of a caveat there. They also offer subscriptions, and obviously they're pre-downloaded onto all iPhones. So for as long as we are all addicted to Apple and iPhones, these guys will probably be a forerunner. And that's why their charts tends to be considered the charts. And actually, just this week, I don't know if anyone's seen, but there's rumblings that they're going to introduce video as well. And then my final two players are kind of outliers in the space. So Facebook. Why am I talking about Facebook? Well, last month, they basically announced that they were pulling out of the race. They were closing all their podcast offerings, and they basically don't want to compete for the monopoly of the audio space. I think they're probably going to be concentrating on the metaverse instead. But if you were putting a lot of efforts into Facebook, perhaps it isn't the way to go, and I might not concentrate my efforts here. And last up, YouTube. So why am I talking about YouTube? It's not an audio platform. It's not even a podcast-specific platform. Well, put your hand up if any of you guys already put your podcast on YouTube. Okay, so there's about, I'd say about 25% of us in here do it. Well, in the US, they just did a recent survey that said that 25% of respondents consume their podcasts on YouTube, and that was the biggest proportion out of all the different listening platforms. So in the US, that's one of the most used listening platforms. Spotify came in second at 23%. So clearly, podcasts are being consumed on there, and YouTube are really keen to get podcasters on the platform. Recently, they offered podcasters a 50 grand cash grant to put their show on YouTube. And from a podcaster point of view, it's a really interesting one because it allows a greater amount of engagement with your audience you don't get on those other distribution channels. So, for instance, they've just launched a super thanks tipping feature for anyone with over 1,000 subscribers, which means people will be able to watch your podcast, tip you, and have their comments highlighted and pinned higher up the comment section. So, as I said, from an engagement standpoint, that's something you just don't get with Spotify or Apple. The only thing I would caveat before putting lots and lots of effort into YouTube is that viewing figures aren't the same as download figures. And when you're making deals in the podcast space, you generally are talking about download figures. And so that's just something to bear in mind. But obviously, having a huge amount of YouTube views is equally amazing. Okay, so those are our key players. So now we know the size of the industry, we know the key players who operate in it. Let's talk about the different deals you can make. What do I mean by deal? Well, a deal is your opportunity to get really creative in the way you move in the industry. But before I go into it in too much detail, I wanted to make a quick note on IP. So obviously, I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I just think it's worth mentioning IP, intellectual property. So that's what you're selling as a creator. So if you have an original script, concept, format, music, they all have value, and that is what you're kind of making this deal on. That's your leverage. And most of the deals that I'm going to talk about now, actually all of them, you need to have ownership of your IP to make them. And I'm sure most of you do anyway, but it's just a quick caveat. So how many deals can you make? the limit does not exist. At Max Creative, we have never made 2 deals the same way, and that's when the kind of status, the fact that there's no status quo that I mentioned at the beginning, means you can be really creative in the way you move. But for the purposes of today, I've just listed 3 deals that are really common in the space and could be interesting for you as a creator. First of all, podcast to book. Obviously been done by Elizabeth Day very successfully twice now. So this is a really interesting deal if you have a lot of guests on your podcast and you're learning lots of information and you kind of want to put it in one place. That's obviously what Elizabeth Day did with her second book, Philosophy. It's an also really interesting one if perhaps you're kind of scratching the surface on a topic that you just need more words to really get into. Secondly, podcast to TV show. I'm sure we've all seen The Dropout recently being made into the Hulu TV show with the same name. It's not the first of its kind. Netflix Dirty John was originally a podcast with the same name. And actually, the most interesting thing, I think, is that it doesn't just have to be these kind of documentary feature-style shows that make that move. So Chris and Rosie Ramsey, Shagged, Married, Annoyed, I'm sure we've all seen it on the charts if we don't already listen to it. Their podcast is now a TV show. So it can be interview format shows as well, and it's just their podcast on TV. And finally, podcasts and live events. So these guys, My Dad Wrote a Porno, went on a world tour with their show, which is just insane and amazing. This is taking your podcast on a road. It's a really common thing. Hands up if you've been to a live show of your favourite podcast. Okay. I would say it's about 80% of the room. I've been to lots as well. It's a great way to engage with your audience, to actually see them face to face, to have those conversations. And I think it's also worth noting it doesn't just have to be literally your podcast live. Fern Cotton, again, I'm sure we all know this in the room already, but is doing a festival version of her podcast. So I'm sure there'll be a live podcast there. But she's kind of taken that heart and her soul of the festival, of the podcast, and making it into a festival. So that's kind of an example of where you could perhaps be a little bit more creative. All right, so those are our 3 deals. I'm going to then talk about some future trends that I've noticed, and I think when you're moving around the space, it's just worth keeping an eye on these. Caveat being, I don't have a magic 8 ball. I can't say any of this for sure, but I would just have my eye on these ones. So, the growing distinction between always-on shows like Parenting Hell, that drops twice a week, I think, and has done for about 3 years now, and the more kind of feature documentary-style shows. So I think we're starting to basically see that the industry is sophisticating and that both these kind of podcasts have a space and both can be successful. So you don't have to be releasing twice a week to have a really great show. I don't know if anyone listened to Harsh Reality, but it was amazing and it was really successful. And there are more and more shows like this being made and still kind of getting to the top of the charts. The recent one, Unreal, about reality TV was another example of that. The kind of caveat from a creator point of view is that it is harder to monetize a documentary style show. There's more upfront work involved and you don't kind of infiltrate people's listener habits the way you do with a always on show. But there's kind of more IP play that you potentially could have later down the line. Next up, video. So I've kind of already spoken about this one a little bit because I spoke about Spotify and that's kind of an image of what I was trying to explain, and YouTube. And I feel like interest in video has really peaked since Diary of a CEO. I know I talk about it all the time and people come to me being like, yeah, can we just do something a bit like Stephen Bartlett? And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that studio costs 50 grand, and no one's coming to me with those budgets. But I think it's a really interesting one because 6 out of 10 weekly listeners said that they preferred podcasts with video. So that might not be your audience, but it's probably worth asking the question if it is. And from an engagement point of view, it's also really interesting to look into. So I went to Tom Webster's talk on YouTube at the podcast show last month. I don't know if anyone else went. He's brilliant from Edison Research. And he said that his research showed that the main ways people find new podcasts is either through recommendation or Google. So obviously, Google favors YouTube, so that's great. And in terms of recommendations, how many times have you gone to YouTube to watch one video and then found yourself there an hour later watching a completely random video because you've gone down a bit of a rabbit hole? So the kind of algorithm on YouTube will introduce people to your show, potentially. And while I'm on that kind of algorithm, I should probably mention TikTok. Obviously, as the home of the algorithm, you watch one cat video on TikTok, you're there an hour later with like loads of cat videos. And so the likelihood is that if you are uploading videos about your podcast, the topics you tend to talk about in your podcast, you will be introduced to people who like those topics. I suppose the only thing that we're wary of, we haven't done much at YouTube at MAG, about TikTok at MAGs, would be, okay, great, they've watched your TikTok video. Does that mean they're now going to listen to a 40-minute episode? So what's that conversion? Is it frictional? And lastly, Web3. I'm definitely not an expert in Web3, but I'm really trying to be. I really want more women to be involved in the next iteration of the internet. It's coming for us, whether we like it or not. We may as well try to get our heads around it. And is it coming to podcasting? Well, iHeartMedia, who I spoke about a little bit at the beginning, recently bought an NFT, the Non-Fun Squad, to be the host of their next podcast. So what does that mean? Well, it basically means that they are going to hire voice actors to represent these NFTs. It sounds more complicated than it is. Basically, think of it like Doctor Who. It's a character who can be narrated by replaceable actors in that case. But I don't think it's a no-brainer yet. So Patreon recently asked their users if they wanted to be able to pay in crypto, and I think that it's 43% of people said no, and 34% that said that they actually just didn't care, and 8% said they thought it was crucial. So it's not a must-have in the industry yet, but I think it's probably coming, and it's worth just getting a bit literate with it, I suppose. And there we go. So hopefully this has been useful for you all. We've done a bit of an overview. We've spoken about the key players. We've had a look at the different deals you can make. And then we just ended with some future trends that maybe will kind of light up a bit of inspiration. I think we now have some time for Q&As, if anyone has any questions.
Hello, I've got a microphone here. I'll just walk around and give.
Hello.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, you lost me on the last one. What was that crypto cartoon thing? So I didn't understand it at all. I didn't understand it, sorry.
Oh, about the crypto? So Patreon asked their users if they wanted to be able to pay to use Patreon in cryptocurrency rather than in pounds sterling or dollars. And basically people said not yet.
So with that cartoon thing?
Yes, the NFTs.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know how well I can explain this one, so you're going to have to come with me on the journey a bit.
Yeah.
So, iHeartMedia bought NFTs who are non-refundable tokens, what they said. The Non-Fun Squad, who I think are a pretty high-profile NFT. And so those characters will now voice their next podcast show. So in the metaverse, I assume the Non-Fun Squad will be there with a mic, but it will be voiced by humans. Yeah, I'm still not taking you on this journey. To be honest, I'm not sure I'm the best person, but it might be worth looking into.
Okay. Anybody else has a question?
Hello.
Hi, thank you very much. You mentioned all those big key players, but
Yeah.
I was wondering about those that are maybe lower profile, such as Clubhouse or Twitter, Sound
Yeah.
or Space. What about those? Are they still not yet viable, or can we potentially look into those for the future?
Yeah, I mean, Clubhouse is a really interesting one. I don't know how many of you guys, I think it went huge when we were in lockdown. I think everyone was like, must get on Clubhouse, must do a talk on Clubhouse. I haven't seen it super translate to the podcast space yet. It feels more like an iteration of Web3, I think, than perhaps a kind of podcast space. I think Spotify did something similar with the Greenhouse. It was called something like that, where they're experimenting with it as well. I think it's a really interesting place to kind of raise your profile as a broadcaster. But in terms of, I don't know, getting your show commissioned, getting it funded, reaching new audiences with your show, it might not be the best route. But I don't know, I'm happy to be proven wrong on that. It's just not something we've explored a lot.
Should we take a question on that side?
Hi, so under the deals,
Yes.
You've talked about really big podcasts,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I think a lot of us here are sort of indie and smaller. So what advice can you give to us who are either still starting out or just, you know, with a smaller audience and maybe very niche genres?
I think the main thing to say there is I don't think niche necessarily is not bad, but not even a detrimental thing. So especially when it comes to advertising. So I think sometimes podcasts which have a very broad kind of subject matter, it's actually harder to find an advertiser for unless you've got massive listenership, because it's really hard to be able to tell a brand that their specific target audience is the audience you have, because it's talking about something so general. But if you have a more niche podcast, I don't know what your podcast is about, so I'm just going to pull ideas here. But say you've got a running podcast, you know that everyone who's listening to your podcast, it might not be, you know, as many people as Parenting Hell, because that's how many parents there are, but everyone who listens to your podcast likes to run. It would make sense for a trainer brand then to sponsor your podcast, because they know those people will be listening, who are their target audience. So in terms of the deals, I think that kind of means the same thing as well. I think understanding your audience is the main thing that you can leverage, and that will bring to you. And so you can kind of make that better engagement with your audience. I think that's the best place to start. Was that a woolly answer? I hope it wasn't. Okay, good. That's on here. So we're going to tip it off the stage. The lights are quite bright. I will see your faces.
How would kind of a smaller podcast, your kind of partnerships lead?
Yeah.
If someone's thinking, you know, my podcast sits in the right kind of realm for Mags Creative, what are you looking for? What could we put together to come to you to kind of become a partner and join the network? What are you after?
So Mags Creative are actually a production company. So we don't partner with existing shows. When my partnerships title is more partnerships of brands for our shows. So that's the kind of caveat there. But I think in general, when pitching your podcast, knowing your audience, knowing what your USP is, knowing what your value is, being able to really kind of have that vocabulary to talk about what you're selling, because that's essentially what you are doing when you're pitching your shows, you're selling it. So being able to talk really confidently about, I know there's that much money going into podcast industry in the UK. I know advertisers are spending that much, and I know my audience is this specific people who are the target audience of your brand. Like, it makes sense. And being really creative with your deals. So again, if this is a sponsorship deal, you know, how can you make it more than just a 30-second ad? Now we've got video. Can you have video come into it? Do you have any social followings that you could come into it? So trying to make a really interesting deal. You don't have to just do the £30 CPM and hope for the best. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Thank you. So as a podcaster,
Yes.
would you then approach brands direct? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I would. I mean, it really depends on your show, but I think I would. I think the monetization platforms, so Acast, Addelicious, all those guys, tend to have a kind of minimum amount of downloads for the shows they'll work with, which is actually quite a lot, especially as an independent podcaster. So if you have a kind of niche show and you already know brands that you think your listeners would love, I would email them directly. I would go on LinkedIn, find a head of marketing, head of press, and email them and kind of put your case forward.
Okay. Yeah, so I just wonder, maybe I'm the only one who's a bit confused about.
No.
So Mags Creative, you talked about
Yes.
yourself being a production company.
Yes.
But also you work with brands. So are you
Yeah.
creating podcasts specifically for brands in order to take that advertising revenue?
Yeah. So we do create podcasts for brands, but so those Mags Creative Originals I spoke about, we have brand sponsors. So we pitch to brands to get them to sponsor those original podcasts as well. So we do a podcast called Castaway or a podcast called Welfare. And so to get those podcasts funded, I would pitch to brands and ask them, essentially, do you want to sponsor our podcast? We will give you X and Y deliverables.
So would it be possible to come to you with a podcast idea then and say, could you match this idea with a brand so you could be funded up front?
Unfortunately not. I mean, I would love to be able to offer that. You can always come and talk to me and I can give you any kind of insight I have or knowledge I know, but we don't act as the kind of in-between between podcaster and brand. That's kind of what Acast or Adalicious or those guys do. But the only kind of caveat if people are thinking about monetizing through those platforms is they take a revenue cut. So they'll match you, but then they'll take a revenue cut of the amount of money you make. So it's just something to bear in mind.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
You mentioned about the video.
Yes.
And I do a lot of interviews over Zoom. So Zoom, is it worth going on YouTube with a Zoom video?
I mean, like, to be completely transparent, we haven't put any of our podcasts on YouTube yet, not because there's any kind of great thinking, it's just we haven't done it yet for any of our shows. I think experiment, find out, see what happens. I don't think there's a huge amount of loss from doing that, especially if you've got the video, and then you can see what kind of traction you have. As I said, it's like an early days thing, but I think from doing the podcast, watching podcast talks at the podcast show, everyone's been speaking about video. And so I just think having some sort of strategy in your head for video is worth it.
So you don't really know whether the quality of what you can produce will have a positive or negative impact? No, because it might have a negative.
Yeah, it might do.
I have to tell all my interviewees to wear makeup and comb their hair.
Well, yeah, that is actually, in terms of your release forms, it is something to think about. Like, people might not have said yes to video, but it could be interesting.
Hello.
Hello.
So I run a production company and we make audio drama.
Amazing.
Is that something that Mags Creative would be interested in co-producing?
Oh my gosh, absolutely. Come and speak to me after this.
Okay,
that
cool.
sounds very cool. We created Life Sentence last year, which was our first, and the producers somewhere in this audience, which was our first kind of foray into audio drama. So we'd love to speak to someone who knows more about it than we do, absolutely. That'd be amazing.
And somebody over here.
There were two over there. No? This lady?
Sorry, right behind you.
Hello.
Hi. I was going to ask about when you are sort of starting to put deals together with brands, are you pitching cold, or are you kind of, and do you come up against marketing, sort of blocks in marketing and what they want to do with their money and their spend, or are you going for pitches that already exist from brands that are putting stuff out to tender?
So at Mags now, if we create branded content, it does tend to be inbound. But in the early days of Mags, I definitely did a lot of cold pitching. And that's still something I do quite a lot, actually. So it can be done. I think if you are pitching to brands cold, I think be really specific about why you're the right match and why it makes more sense to do a deal which might be a bit more holistic with your podcast than for them to spend X amount of impressions at a monetization platform. So they could just take their budget, take it to Acast or other platforms and just spend it that way. So what do you have that is different to that? And that's making a really kind of authentic brand deal that might include social, that might include live event, that might include something on video. So I just think being able to talk about what you have to offer, which is a bit different, is the way to go about that. But be persistent. I used to literally follow up like 3 times, add them on LinkedIn, message them on LinkedIn. Like, you've got to get all the different, Instagram, message them. If you really think that like this is the perfect brand fit, it'll be a no-brainer for them. And go with those nice stats I showed you, like 65% of podcast listeners pay attention. I think there's also a really nice one. 71% of podcast listeners take an action after hearing an ad on a podcast. So have your stats at the ready. Stats always go down well.
you.
Hello.
Charlotte.
Hiya.
My question's kind of along the same lines of sponsorship. So
Yeah.
I've been trying to find like sponsors for my podcast for a while.
Yeah.
And it's I just never know how much to ask for. Like I get to the bit where we're chatting and it's like, cool, so let's talk numbers. And I'm like, I actually have no idea what. I don't want to be mugged off by you. I don't want to mug you off.
Yeah.
And I know that's sort of like how long is a piece of string, because it obviously depends on so many variables. But like, if you're an independent podcaster, say you're getting like 500-ish downloads per, like how do you, like where do you start?
Honestly, it's so difficult. And I think that is when the fact that it does feel a little bit chaotic does actually just make it a little bit stressful, because there is the only kind of key thing out there, which is probably industry-wide, is that CPM, which is cost per 1,000 downloads. The average in the UK is about £35. So if you do it that way, that is one way you could do it, but that's not going to be super favourable for independent creators, and actually I don't think it's the most helpful way to do the industry. That's very like kind of armchair expert opinion there. But I would also think about the time that you'll put into it. Think about, I don't know what else you do in your day job, but do you have an hourly rate? So like, how much time are you putting into producing that episode? If you're making a branded episode with them, how much time are you putting into scripting the ad, recording the ad, editing the ad, producing the ad, getting it out there? So think about your time as well. I then think about the reach of it, introduce those different levers, so it's not just the podcast as well, so you can really offer them a really kind of holistic package. I know I keep saying that, but I really think that's what independent creators have in their kind of toolbox that bigger monetization platforms maybe don't have. So I really think leverage that. But that is a bit of a woolly answer to say there is no, I wish I could be like, if I was you, I'd ask for this much. I mean, that's obviously the dream. But I would just think about time. I would think about that £35 CPM as a rough-ish guide. And then I would be like confident it's worth it. You have value in your podcast, aim high, and then, you know, the worst they can say is no. And you're also not mugging anyone off. So like, don't worry that you're like secretly scamming someone. Like they're grown-ups, they know how to invest their money, and that's fine. Yeah.
Thanks.
CPM, so that's cost per mil. So that's cost per 1,000 downloads, and that's how spot ads, radio style ads, and Acast and so like cost up their costings. But so that's obviously amazing if you've got hundreds and thousands of listeners.
Any more questions from this side?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for all those exciting words.
Okay.
If, again, looking at it from a really independent podcasting perspective, it's you and a producer, you yourself.
Yeah.
How do you target your social media? If you don't have the time to work across 3 different platforms, how do you prioritise which one to go ham on, as it were?
As in, how do you prioritise between podcasts, social media, YouTube?
How to choose. So, for example, say you want to only use one platform to promote your podcast. Maybe a bad idea in the first place. Say you only want to use Instagram. I don't have the time to work across to Twitter.
Yes.
Because it doesn't translate as well, whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do you choose which to prioritise, and how do you best manage your time with that?
Well, our brilliant Max Creative Marketing lead is actually in here today, so she'd be really great to answer this question. But I'm going to steal her words, tell you. So at Max, we actually don't put that much time and resources into social media for our shows. To date, we have never seen there to be the best transition between social media to actual download, which is like our ultimate kind of North Star is download figures. And we have worked with really, really high profile people with like these amazing Instagram audiences, and we would get them as the guests on our shows, and we're like, this is it, like this is what's going to get our show to the next level. Please post afterwards, like sending them the story assets and everything. And they would post them and not a huge amount would happen, and we'd be like, I think that a big audience doesn't always mean engaged audience, and so actually smaller usually does mean a bit more engaged. But I think actually it's just a different ask. Like when people are scrolling through social, and that's what I was kind of trying to say about TikTok, when people are scrolling through social and watching a kind of 1 second clip, or 3 or whatever it is, they're not necessarily in the headspace to be like, oh, and now I want to listen to a 40-minute episode about something, I don't know, deep or emotional or entertaining. And so we've actually found that we would concentrate most of our efforts into in-audio advertising. So by that, I mean pitching to do cross-proms with other shows in the same genre as yours. Being a guest on other podcasts is a really good way to do it. Pitching to distribution platforms. So even as independent creators, you can all pitch to Apple to be on that carousel. That's editorial. There's a team at Apple who decide who gets to be on there, and you can pitch to them. So I think I would put more effort into audio, into podcasts initially.
Any other questions?
Any questions? Oh, okay, well.
Hi,
hey.
Thank you. How do we pitch into Apple?
Well, perfect. Everyone take my email address after this, and I will send you the link. And then it's a link and it's a form, and you put your like podcast title, the show, the name of the show you're pitching, a bit of a like nice brief and pitch, and you attach like a carousel artwork. And then they also share the spec for that artwork. I can share that as well if you want, but everyone can do that.
That's great, thank you.
Hi.
Does it say anything to Spotify?
No, I don't. I mean, Alicia? No, it does not. No.
Okay. Any last questions? Oh, one more here. Okay.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, just popped into my head,
Yeah.
like, you guys, do you ever pitch to like Acast and Amazon for like Prime series? You know how they're like, this is something original?
Amazon. So yeah, you can.
Because like I know that a lot of production companies do that. Like they'll be like Fable or whatever. They'll be like, oh, going to do that.
Yeah.
But I'm curious as to whether independent podcasters can find, you know, the creative director of whoever and just be
you know
like,
what? I bet you
pitch
can.
something?
I really bet you can, because actually they're one of the really lovely team at Amazon actually just did a talk here today, so you can go find her afterwards. Her name's Megan. She's great. But yes, absolutely. I don't see why not. I mean, again, I can't talk for Amazon. They might be like, don't. But I think absolutely go for it. Acast, just to say, Acast is a monetization platform. They don't actually produce their own content. If I'm wrong, everyone tell me. But I'm pretty certain in that. So they monetize with the ads rather than produce content.
Well, thank you very much. I
Oh
think
my God.
it's time to come
Thanks,
to
guys.
thank Charlotte
you were so
for
nice. I was so
a
nervous.
wonderful
Thank
presentation.
you.